Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to say a few words in my capacity as Chair of the Committee of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, and welcome you all to this seminar. It would be of particular interest to the OFM-DFM Committee because children and young people's issues are a central strand of the work that we do. OFM have a 10-year strategy for children and young people, which is there to reflect a commitment to ensure all children and young people get the best start in life and are helped to reach their full potential. Now, those are words I think you probably hear any politician say, but for me it has meaning because when I look back at my little life, it was shaped by my parents and by my parents' values. Their value, for example, of education for their children, and their willingness to commit, and also their ability financially to provide the funds and the resources to make that commitment. And if you think about educational underachievement, how do you fix that? Well, you don't do it just in the schools, because if you look at research coming out of Manchester University, Alan Dyson, he would say up to 80% of the influence on a child's education lies outside of the school campus. So if parents don't have an understanding of the value of education for their children, if the community doesn't have an understanding of the value of education for the children, then the child has a high likelihood of being an underachiever at school, no matter how good the teaching and the leadership of the teaching is within the school. We also, at OFM-DFM Committee, look to the Developing Social Change framework from the Department, which aims to coordinate government action not only on reducing levels of child poverty, but promoting better health outcomes, better education, and indeed better environments for children to grow up to and to flourish within. Attitudes towards family life, parenting and the role of the state change constantly all around the world, but research evidence on trends in child well-being, it's mixed, and that means there are important challenges for policymakers to understand what is happening around the world and what is best practice to be adopted and adapted for Northern Ireland. I would say good parenting is important because it impacts upon areas such as children's educational achievement, as I mentioned, and that has an important role to play in changing and challenging social exclusion. We recognise parents are the best people to raise their children. However, the question for government is how can we support parents and families in their role as primary caregivers. And it's from research such as Mary's that we gain the new evidence to help us formulate effective family and child policy. And again, just to go back to education, this week there was a very good debate here in the Assembly on absenteeism and the research and the data which links high levels of absenteeism to the wards which have the highest levels of multiple deprivation. So these very, very clear links, and engaging parents in the educational process is a key target for this Assembly, surely, if we want to tackle and make life better for our young people. So it's because of those key issues that I think that this seminar is going to be so very important for you, and I'm very pleased to welcome Mary Daly to present her findings this afternoon. Mary, you're very welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the introductions, Mr. Nesbitt and also Jane. It's a great pleasure for me and for my school, which is the School of Sociology and Social Policy and Social Work at Queen's, to be here. I mean, we believe very much in conversations, in listening to what policymakers and practitioners are doing, and in also having a conversation about what we're doing. And we see this very much as a partnership and as a way of exchange, and I'm very happy to be part of that. So the first slide is a slide about what is it. And I think the undertext or the subtext of this slide is that it's very complex and it's very diverse, and one has to, in a way, be very specific about what one is talking about when one is talking about parenting support. In the first bullet point, I try and give you a generic definition of what I consider parenting support is. So to read that out, it's refers to a range of information, support, education, training and counselling, and other measures or services that focus on influencing how parents understand and carry out their parenting role. So there are two things I would ask you to bear in mind from that first sentence. One, it's education and skills for parenting, which in a way is relatively novel when you think about it, because we've always taken parenthood, we've never even had a term parenting before. We've always taken, or usually taken, parenthood for granted, except when people get babies in the first instance. But this refers to a much broader sense of educating parents. And the second sense is it's around the doing of parenthood. We used to think of child rearing, we used to talk of child rearing, but now we talk of parenting. And I think that's quite interesting for me as a sociologist and a social policy person. I think what's being influenced there is there's a narrowing of focus on the parent-child relationship, because child rearing has a much broader sense of the child in society, but there's also very much a focus on the doing of parents, on the way parents interact with their children, and on the way they encourage or discourage certain behaviours on the part of their children. The second point on the slide emphasises the diversity, and I think the way of thinking about this is maybe to see it as a continuum, or on a continuum. So on one end you have generic information, brochures, websites, helplines for just telephone information services about maybe the challenges involved in parenting, how to solve a problem if it's not a very profound problem. And most countries have that kind of information available. The opposite end of the continuum is where you have very intensive engagement with families, particularly usually problem families, or what are called problem families. And if people are aware of the family intervention projects in the United Kingdom, that it would be this kind of idea where every family, or the families involved, would have a one worker that would work intensively with them, or maybe a number of workers that would work intensively with families. And while these have always existed, I think what's interesting about these now is that they're focusing very much on parenting as a means of bringing about change in the family. Their focus is obviously on child welfare, but it's child welfare not necessarily through focusing on the child, but rather focusing on parent-child relationship and parent-child interaction. And this has started to become very popular in Europe, particularly in the 2000s. As I said, it existed prior to this, but over the last decade and a half, this has been a flood in Europe. And in next week alone, there are two major governmental conferences in Europe on the topic of parenting support. The Dutch government is having one, and the German government is having one. And parenting support, which is a diversified term, is very widely used now in EU and other policy circles. I have 3 slides about where it's coming from, because I think it's really important that we interrogate and that we understand where things have become fashionable, either in a short time or over time. I think it's very important that we understand where these are coming from. And these are coming, I think, we have to locate them in a way in society, and changes coming from how people are thinking, how the discourse of the media and so forth, but also how policymakers think. And of course there's a very strong linkage between how policymakers think and what people, parents, families, constituents, the media, etc., are suggesting. In this slide I've suggested that there are 3 kind of things that are leading to this. The first is the whole concern about children children's development, children's well-being, and that sometimes is a very positive message that we should be encouraging development in our children, we should be enabling them to learn, we should be protecting them from risks and so forth, but can also be coming from a negative dimension in the sense of the many cases we've had of child abuse or children being damaged or children being at risk or so forth. So there's two sides to this, and that there's also a negative side of tending to blame parents. I think, as I said earlier, we tend to put the spotlight much more on parents than we used to in the past. Some of this child-related stuff is coming from neuroscience and the thinking around scientific developments around brain development, for example, and the negative influence of, or the influence of negative impacts early in life. There's a strong sense now that they actually negatively affect not just subsequent development in children, but actual brain development. So that has to be factored in as well. Family functioning is another very strong concern, and actually for somebody like me who studies social policy development in Europe, family policy is probably the single growth area, maybe not quite the single, because I think activation is another big growth area, but family policy is a major growth area at a time when other countries or when other areas of policy are being cut back. Family policies such as childcare, parental leave, reconciliation of work and family life, parenting support. This seems to be an area where governments, they may not be prepared to put in more money in it, but they're really prepared to rethink existing services. Some of this is coming out of this view that families are increasingly dysfunctional, for example, or that we have more dysfunctional families than we did in the past, or just a general problematizing of the way people live their family lives. A third spur to it is coming from a certain demand from parents themselves. As parents, people seem to be increasingly worried about the way they're rearing their children. And of course, we now live, probably for the first time ever, in a society where it is normal for two parents to work. So we're still really coming to terms with the kinds of changes generated by both mother and father working where they can get work, that is. And that's a kind of a sense of tension coming from parents themselves as well, the feeling that they don't have enough time with their children, that they can't do well with children. So there's a demand for support from parents, a greater anxiety around parenting. A second source is it's coming very much, I think, from international policy as well. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which, as you know, was passed in 1989, I think that was like a stone dropping into a pond, really, and that the ripples go wider and wider and wider. And while, of course, we know that what that did was put two very concepts around children at the fore, children's rights, but also this whole concept of the best interests of the child. But what's less known about the UN Convention is that it also set out a relatively strong set of claims about parents and the obligations of parents in particular, and the role of parents. And it in a way, while I think it prioritized children, the subtext there was children and parents very much together. And states have to respect the rights of parents as well as the rights of individual children. So that is a push for this kind of. We never really had a definition of parenting before. We never really had a conception of parenting before that. We had a conception of mothering and what was a good mother, but we never had a sense of what a good parent was. And while this isn't the source necessarily of that, all of these are contributing factors. The Council of Europe has also been extremely important, and for the last 15, 20 years been passing recommendations about the optimum conditions of child welfare, family life, and specifically about parenting. And I refer there specifically to the 2006 recommendation on what they call positive parenting. And if you take a moment to reflect, even the term, I think, positive parenting is quite interesting. And this is one, you know, so when I say parenting is new, but then we have positive parenting, and of course that begs the question of what is negative parenting, really? But even that term itself is new. And then my third slide, and I think the third thing of where it came from, is national. Some national governments have promoted it very strongly. And New Labour in the UK, really, from the time they came into power until the time they left it in 2010, were very concerned about children and families in the first instance. But I would say that over the course of the three governments, or the tenure of New Labour, the figure of the parent became bigger and bigger and bigger in their discourse and in their policies. And as you'll see from a later slide, New Labour, I would argue, put in place the most sophisticated architecture and the most overarching architecture anywhere in the world for parenting support. In a way, they pioneered it, I think, in a way that, you know, no other government has done. And other governments in Europe are very interested as well. Angela Merkel's government, for example, very concerned about the performance of German children in the international leagues around education. How much, you know, how well do children perform? How well are they do in the classic tests around maths and English or whatever. And so Germany started to fall down on the scale, and that's one of the reasons why the German government is interested in putting money into parenting support. There's also commercial developments, because a lot of the programs that are put in place are actually commercial, and they're actually quite expensive for governments to buy. And so there's always a market element, I think, involved here as well. And the three, I have 5 programs there, but I just give you an example of 3. Triple P, which the Triple P stands for Positive Parenting Program, Incredible Years, and then Strengthening Families, Strengthening Communities. People may be familiar with them. I give a slide later on what's actually involved. And this is actually the slide. And this is just to give you one example of Triple P. And Triple P is operated in Northern Ireland, not that widely. It's much more widely utilised in other countries, particularly in England. And it has 5 different levels, such that actually it never stops in a way. A family could be undergoing Triple P for the entire time their children are young, until they're 18 or 19, which is interesting because, of course, there's another side to that, which is, do we really want that level of intervention in families? Do families really need that level of intervention? But you'll see, in a way, this covers the continuum that I spoke of earlier. Information, general measures to ease parents' worries, what seems to work in a situation if your child doesn't want to go to school or has, maybe certain kinds of behavioural difficulties and so forth. A brief 1 or 2 session, moving on to level 2, of primary health care intervention for mild behavioural difficulties in children. Moving on to a 3rd level, which is more interventionist still, more work with parents, either on a 1-to-1 or a group session. 4 is an intensive 8 to 10 session program, which is either can be individual, group or self-directed, with telephone support for more severe problems. And then 5 is a very, very intensive, usually long duration family intervention process. And these programs, particularly 4, this idea of the parenting course, the parenting program, these were very, very, and probably still are, even though the coalition has changed in the UK somewhat, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. But these programs are very widely used in the UK. It's estimated that over 100,000 parents have been in this kind of general information session in England alone. What's new about it? Parenting support, as I've said, is not completely new. In most settings, it's a development and extension of older ideas. Most usually help when a baby is first born or in the child's first year. Health visitors, for example, family nurse partnerships, and so forth. So the idea that parent needed support has always been there, that mothers need support in particular, but there's also been in recent years the understanding that fathers need support. Parenting support tends to be a genderless discourse, which is, for somebody like me, something I would note very, very clearly, because of course parenting is not a genderless activity, but it's a genderless activity or a genderless discourse by and large. I mean, the programs do cover the different roles of parents, but it's talked about as if it's without sex or gender differentiations. So it's an old idea. However, I suppose I'm saying that there are two aspects of it that are relatively new. I think this idea of intervening or giving parents skills and education about how they relate to their child is new on the scale in which it's being done. Because we've always, as I said, had this sense that maybe there were some parents who would need help, either because perhaps they're in situations of difficulty or it may be a pregnant by accident, an unexpected pregnancy, or some other kind of difficulty. But there is here, particularly in the way it was generalized by New Neighbour in England, there's a sense that any parent who needs it should be able to get support, either of a kind of a non-interventionist or a highly interventionist basis. So there's a move towards universal provision. And there's also a move beyond infants and beyond younger children. Again, it was kind of widely accepted that there might be a lot of pressure on families when children are young, especially if they have more than one very young child. But now the sense is right across the age range that parents need support. So you have a lot of programs for parenting your teenager, for example, which is one of the programs, very popular program run by Parenting NI in Northern Ireland. And also, of course, what's new about this is the state, and by the state I mean the public authorities. The state now has really very strong opinions about what a good parent is, and is often not very slow to intervene and say, well, this is good, so all parents should read to their children, or all parents should spend quality time with their children, or parents shouldn't work long hours because that's bad for their children. So I think the level of state engagement with this is also relatively new. I have 2 or 3 slides, and I'm on good time, I think, coming up on what's happening in different countries. And as I said, I think New Labour, in a way, is the case study of a country that has gone furthest. England under New Labour, I should say. The coalition has started to undo some of it, but there is still, as my understanding, quite a broad-ranging infrastructure of parenting support available in England. So the trajectory in England was from government down, really. There was some level of demand from parents up, but it was very much a government New Labour project, starting with child poverty, a concern about child poverty, a concern about rundown areas which had very poor services. And you'll be familiar with the Sure Start programme, which was very much about putting in place in the most deprived areas, as they're called, a diversified set of family services. So New Labour started very concerned about children, about child poverty, and about areas that suffered multiple deprivation, and started this integrated, very innovative, I think, service model in Sure Start. And then they generalised this to children's centres. And children's centres, as you know, were rolled out they weren't just for the most deprived areas anymore, they were rolled out to most areas. But as they were rolled out, their service offer got more generic, and they were focused very much on childcare and on enabling parents to work in one way or another. However, both Sure Start and Children's Centre came to realise that the parent was a key figure, or became convinced over time that the parent or parents should be a key figure for intervention. And so they rolled out education program for parents, these 8 to 10 week courses primarily, that parents could come and ask for, or in some cases that parents were strongly recommended by the courts, because of course what New Labour also did was introduce parenting orders, whereby parents who were seen not, or if their children were misbehaving, they were given a certain program of supervision and activities by the court. And part of this could be that they had to attend a parenting program or engage in an intensive intervention project. They were parent from 2006 on. Every local authority had to have a parenting commissioner. They put together a database of evidence-based programs that they could stand behind. At one stage, there were 95 evidence-based programs that these parenting commissioners would consult to run, to select whatever program they thought would work in their area. They had this family nurse partnership, which is focused on very young, so-called or understood to be vulnerable mothers. And that was rolled out, but that was focused on families, or as I said, vulnerable. They had a national academy for parenting practitioners, that is people who offer these courses or who work on these courses, who vary very much from highly skilled or highly trained professionals to people who might have just 2 weeks training, because a lot of these parenting courses are run off a manual. And what it is, you need to know the manual, and the manual tends to be taught in 2 weeks. And because that can be, you can learn it so quickly, they're actually relatively cheap to run. If you had highly trained professionals running these courses, it's much more expensive. They also had a national training board, a training program, a council for the development of the childcare workforce, and a series of family intervention projects, which, by the way, it's estimated, and these were these intensive family parenting programs, it's estimated that 10,000 families in England went through these programs, or are still going through these programs over the course introduced. So this was a really major development. Now the coalition has started to undo some of it. It has a very negative rhetoric around this as part of the nanny state. So government is intervening too much, telling parents what to do. And also other aspects of its policy, like cutting back on public sector expenditure, cutting back on quangos, as they're called, and so forth. So it's got rid or merged some of these institutions. But it is continuing supporting parenting courses, running them in pilot areas for parents of children under 5. And I think it's quite interesting because it's a very mixed message, I think. But parents can go to Boots and pick up a voucher to the value of £100, which they can then bring to a number of named service providers in these localities where these new programs, they're old programs, but they're newly organised, where these are run. And so there's, in some ways you could say there's a normalisation. I mean, Boots the chemist is the place where these, so it's quite, I think it's, as a sociologist, I find it very interesting. Northern Ireland is, in a way, of course, there is a parenting strategy, but it's a generic strategy. So in some ways it's very different to England. In most ways it's very different to England, I think. But so too are Scotland and Wales different to England. England really pursue this in a way that I think no other country has and no other part of the UK has to that extent, at that rapid pace, because what New Labour did, they did in about 6 years, which is really extraordinary, I think. Here, it is more demand-led, which is, in a sense, it's coming from perhaps parents themselves. It's coming from it's very much the voluntary sector. Parenting NI, for example, very prominent service provider, not exclusive service provider, but a very prominent service provider. Another not so prominent as Parenting NI is the Life Start Foundation, which, as you know, and I say it in my written notes anyway, is a voluntary, it's charity, I believe, All Ireland charity. And that has 6 or 7 projects in areas of Northern Ireland, mainly considered high needs areas and it's for rather young children, children under 5. Whereas Parenting NI are picking up offering a much broader range of services and picking up demand from a much broader area of a much broader sector of the population, really, and also parts of the country. And they run, in general, you could say, this is just a summary, information, education programs, and also a parenting forum. So Northern Ireland is at a very different stage, really, in relation to England. But as I said, every other country, I think, is at a different stage in relation to England. I just very briefly put up France and Germany here because we're interested in them for the purpose of this talk only because they follow a very different approach. So France has not got a single parenting program in operation. And part of the reason, France, is that there is a very strong rejection in France of state imposition on the family. Unlike England, where it seems to be accepted that government can intervene very readily in families. So in France, what exists, and the major source of parenting support, is networks organised by parents themselves, which are supported now on a statutory basis. Every district or region in France now must have one of these networks. But they're from the bottom up, really, and they're parents. They're not professional-led. They don't use these kind of manuals and so forth that are used in England quite widely. And they're very softly, what I would call softly, much more parents supporting other parents, organised increasingly on a national basis with some supervision and overview of the national authorities. But generally, it's a very different way, I think. And I put it down because I think it's an interesting experiment or a different model to be thinking about. In Germany, where there is more acceptance of state and regional government having a strong family policy, the whole idea of parenting support is embedded in a much broader sense of family, and the idea that everybody needs to be educated for family life, whether it's mothers or whether it's fathers. And so that's, I mean, in Germany, also in France, and they used to have in the 30s schools for parents. And this was very much, it was partly Catholic, I think, in origin, but the idea, and you might, it's a little bit like pre-marriage courses and so forth. But in Germany, the whole idea of marriage and family life and rearing children needing support is much broader than marriage. The whole idea is that it's very difficult to run family life, and people should get advice and they should get counselling and so forth. So it's coming out of a different dynamic. But there is an increasing, what I would call, instrumentalization. The idea that through offering support for parents, you can bring about other things, like you can improve children's development, you can improve performance, of family life in general, and so forth. So that's an increasing kind of recognition, and they're putting more and more money into that in the last 2 or 3 years in offering parenting programs, but a whole range of other supports for parents. So my last 2 slides. There's a lot of research. This tends to be, even though it's a very new policy area, this policy area has grown partly because it claims to provide a very strong evidence-based. And a lot of these programs that are being run, particularly the 3 or 4 that I mentioned earlier, come with a big base of psychological, usually psychological, but other kinds of quantitative evidence and qualitative evidence. And it is known, for example, or it has been demonstrated, that parenting support makes parenting, slight error on the slide, it can make parenting a less stressful task and also a more enjoyable task. So it reduces parental stress. And there has been, by the Institute of Childcare Research, which is in my school in Queen's, and Mark McCann is here, one of the authors of the report, they've recently done an evaluation of the Parenting Your Teen program being run by Parenting NI. And the evidence, there's quite strong evidence adverted to in that report on what this program, the short-term impact in particular of this program, makes parenting less stressful and more enjoyable. It can reduce the risks of emotional and physical harm to children, and it can improve, or they can improve, children's well-being and development. So the evidence is pretty strong for particular types of intervention. Because it's so new, there hasn't been across-the-board research, but certainly for some of the intensive parenting interventions and the manual-based programs, there's very strong evidence. However, what's really not known is how long these effects endure and whether these impacts last in the long term. That's still quite open. There's also certain worries about parenting intervention. One is that it actually can constitute a kind of an overload for parents. It may actually lead to increase parents' anxiety, whereas in some ways the objective is to reduce parents' anxiety, but it actually may make parents more dependent on help from the outside, less secure about their own skills and their own moral knowledge about what is right and wrong for their child. And that tends to be downplayed a bit in this. Also, there is a very strong risk that it's actually too much intrusion in family life. I mean, historically, family has been regarded as a domain which really state policy should treat very carefully. And of course, historically, the greatest intervention has been in families which have been seen to have a problem of some kind. On the scale in which New Labour developed it, this goes way beyond that, and it's actively engaging with parents and also putting forward a kind of a relatively singular view of what constitutes good parenting. And a lot of it you'd see in programs like Super Nanny or the very many self-help books. And if you look at those programs or read those books, they're actually boiled down to about 6 or 7 things you should do with your child, one of which is that you should distance your child. You need to control your own emotions. And the second, I mean, there are a lot, the naughty step, all of this is very familiar now. And this has seeped, I think, into policy thinking in a way. And I suppose I have a whole series of reservations, but one would be about that maybe we are, not they, giving too much attention to what the experts say and maybe not trusting parents enough at some level. We can talk about that. In the last slide, what I thought would help is to put together a little bit about what is considered good practice in the area. And this is a long list, and I can't really have the time to talk about them. And some of them we'll know from other areas and from existing practice as well. But there's a sense in which programs should have more than one method of delivery, for example, that programs should work, or provisions, however we regard them, should work with concrete objectives, have a clear sense of what they're about. If possible, have a strong underlying theory. And some of these programs have very strong theoretical base, social learning, cognitive behavioral therapy, and so forth. They're very well grounded scientifically, some of these programs. Programs also should be aware that families have multiple needs, and that focusing on parenting alone in ignorance or not taking account of the other dimensions of family life that's affecting how people parent their children, that they have less chance of success. Multi-agency working, joined up services, both of which we're quite familiar with what they mean. There's also in the literature a strong sense that the blanket application of a particular type of program can be counterproductive. So program operators and policymakers themselves need to keep a critical distance to what they're offering. And the last point here is that services that allow multiple routes in and out for families actually are ones that really work best. By way of concluding, and I think I'm still within my time, but I have only a few points to make. So I think the first thing I want to say by way of overview is that when we talk about parenting support, we're talking about a very broad range of provision, and it seems to me it's very important that policymakers and those who study policy or who want to contribute to policy should be aware of that, and maybe should be conscious of the need to define what they mean by parenting support and the principles that should inform parenting support. The second thing, I think for me, and I hope this has come across, I feel this is a really interesting set of developments, and also, as I've tried to say, very new set of developments, but it's also hugely challenging. And we need to be aware of that. I think before we step into this area or step in a broad way in this area, we need to be aware of the challenges. We're crossing a threshold, I think, with this kind of intervention, particularly if it's universalized, and that needs to be considered very carefully. It seems to me also, though, that Europe in general, countries in Europe, the EU also, the international, they're on a roll with this. This is going forward as I see it. I don't see this stopping anytime soon. And I gave you the examples of just in 1 week next week, 2 major conferences, international conferences on it. But I also want to say that there are sets of values that underlie these things, and I really feel we should interrogate the values and know the norms and know what we're doing when we're engaging with it, and have a critical distance to it as well, I think. I also want to say that I feel we need the quality of the evidence. We need to introduce evidence. We need to introduce evidence gathering if we're going to involve ourselves in this and put money into this. And New Labour did that very well, I have to say, in the UK. And in the case of Northern Ireland, and this will be the last thing I will say, is I think that it would be very helpful if some kind of framework document was put together around the development of parenting support in Northern Ireland, which would set out standards, set out ethical principles, set out in as much as one can set out objectives and aims of this kind of intervention. And I think it also has to, this kind of framework document really does have to hear the voices of parents and hear the voices of providers who are providing currently for parents and who have built up quite a big body of knowledge and information around parenting and the development of children in Northern Ireland. So that conversation, I think, between statutory legislators and so statutory bodies, that really needs to go on and in an intensive fashion. And I know, for example, that there is an All-Ireland conversation under the auspices of some of the projects funded by Atlantic Philanthropies. I know that they've started working on what a framework should be for parenting support. And my last point is that just 2 days ago, Scotland produced their first parenting strategy. So I haven't had a chance to look at that, but that's something that might also be of great relevance to Northern Ireland. So thank you very much.